Hello and welcome to Resolutionary Leaders. I'm your host, Helena Gatto, and today I have Maria Garaitonandia. Thank you so much for joining us from Florida.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So Maria is a consultant and a coach, and she works predominantly around increasing interpersonal intelligence. And she has her own, she does a lot of training. Her company is called Global Bridges Training. So welcome and tell us a little bit about yourself.
I have a strange background, and I think that what brought me into the desire to help people communicate was the fact that as a kid, I was what you would call a third culture kid. I was born in the US of Cuban parents, but from the time I was a child, we moved around from country to country for about 10 years. And that obviously gave me a love for all things intercultural, international languages, etc. But one of the things that I realized was as I was growing up and switching schools, being the new kid every couple of years, was that I had to observe and adapt in order to make it in the new environment. And that was like a really important skill to develop because it helped me. And even though it was hard to leave my friends behind and learn a new environment, it helped me learn some very important skills that would help me later on as far as leadership, communication, etc. I always thank goodness that I had these experiences as a kid because those were the skills that actually helped me become an interpersonal intelligent expert.
Yeah, so I can imagine it makes me think about how do you find yourself when you're constantly shifting into different cultures and groups? How do you find yourself?
That's a great question because I'll tell you something. I found that my identity could be pretty fluid. I might have been the nerd in one place and then suddenly I became a little bit of a jock somewhere else.
Really?
Yes, because you find your group of people and then you have to say goodbye to that group, but then you're coming into a new environment. And first you scope everything out. So I would scope out the situation. You pick up who the cool kids are. And of course you have to listen and figure out what makes them tick. And then as kids, you just want to be accepted, right? So you start attaching yourself to where you want to be and you start assimilating a little bit and figuring stuff out. Yeah, without falling into the negative part of peer pressure, but finding where you can reinvent yourself. I would say that my identity changed a little bit. For example, I'll give you an example. In one school, in one country, it was cool to use a little bit of profanity peppered in your language, and that was cool. And then I moved to another country and that was seen as taboo. It was not cool or ladylike. So I had to learn really quick, oh, okay, I can't speak that way here. What's cool here is this method, this language. So I think that if we extrapolate that into our modern corporate world, it teaches you that, for example, if you're moving from one industry or one corporate culture to another, you have to pick up on what the culture is and what's accepted, what's seen as something that'll help you have success, and what is going to maybe put you at a disadvantage. But you have to figure that out quickly.
Yes. Now companies are focused on not just diversity and inclusion, it's about belonging. And what you're talking about is how did you fit in all these different places? So how do you translate that to the company culture where there's a certain amount of shape shifting that's required, but how do you do that and still have a sense of belonging? Because I was hearing that the opposite of belonging is fitting in.
Could be, but here's the thing. I think that sometimes the whole everybody has to adjust to me is a little overrated. There's always going to be a certain degree of, is everybody going to have to change everything for me? Yes, you could say, okay, that's equity or that's inclusion, but there has to be a balance also. Maybe I'm old school, but I think that there has to be this curiosity and openness to have that inclusion, but at the same time, again, if, for example, your company isn't going to just turn into a charity tomorrow, you have to also fit into the objectives of earning your stockholders a return on investment, for example. And we've seen that there is a shift a little bit more towards going back to that. You can't just be spending money hand over fist for a utopia, because we're never going to reach a utopia. You have to have a balance. You have to be kind and gentle and make people want to be happy where they're working. But at the same time, I think we all have a certain obligation to find some kind of happy medium where not one group is going to be the predominant group. I don't know if
I understand I think I understand what you're saying. And I feel like the idea of what belonging is needs to be addressed. You can feel uncomfortable and still belong somewhere.
Right.
Everything doesn't have to feel good all the time. Like my kids belong in our home, but man, they're not always comfortable. It doesn't always feel good. Doesn't mean they don't get into trouble. Doesn't mean they don't say the wrong things. So there's that piece, I think, that we need to get past. Everyone has to feel good all the time. I think belonging is where when you do feel bad, you don't assume the worst, and you're able to have a conversation about it and say, that made me feel awkward. What can I understand what's going on with you?
Absolutely. And I think that's a skill that's very important. And I don't know, when you just mentioned something kind of key, is it a generational thing? There's Jonathan Haidt, the famous sociologist, talks a little bit about the coddling of the American mind. So just in the same way that sometimes kids might eat dirt, they have to develop an immune system. Are we also overprotecting our kids to the point that any little discomfort causes them to fall apart? And I think that, like you said, you know that you are in an environment where it's okay to have a conflict. It's okay. The idea is, how do you have that conflict? How are you going to manage it? How vulnerable do you feel you can be, but at the same time with the expectation that everyone has to bend over backwards to make you feel comfortable? And I think that when it comes to interpersonal intelligence, this is part of what we need to learn. How do you, instead of whining and going and telling on somebody because they said something that bothered you, facing that person? Because I can tell you, a lot of the clients I work with, sometimes when we talk about conflict, I hear a lot of the cases where they're like, oh, I had this issue with a colleague, and instead of resolving it, they went and escalated me, and I felt so betrayed. And I think that's true. There's a good point. Are we giving people the benefit of the doubt? How would you feel if somebody went behind your back and complained about something about you when you didn't have any bad intention? So I always tell people, you know what, always assume positive intent, because it's awful to feel like you've been misjudged. So empathy it's key. It's part of emotional intelligence, is also changing the narrative and trying to make that effort to think, okay, what could be the rational explanation for this other person's behavior? It's probably not that they're out to get me. There might be another explanation. So I think that's part of what needs to be taught early on.
I think that's a shift in the workplace culture that is happening, and it's uncomfortable, it's difficult. However, we've had this moment in time of everybody's so sensitive, and that's okay. At the same time, we need to be able to have a conversation about it and not go running to HR and say, or to whoever, and so saying so-and-so said this and it made me uncomfortable, and triangulating the situation, putting that person in a position where they then go back to that person and say, you made Helena uncomfortable. Don't say things like that anymore. And you've just now just disrupted the trust in that relationship, because now that person that was told, don't speak like that, Helena was upset, doesn't feel like they can address it with me, because that would be retaliation. So you just create this very toxic dynamic when you start to do that. So I think it's the person that is complained to, like let's say it's HR, needs to be able to push back and say, okay, how can I support you? in going and having that conversation and checking that out.
That's exactly the whole point of developing interpersonal intelligence. Now, I must say, there probably is something to be said about Gen Z and the fact that they were locked down for a while during COVID,
Mm-hmm.
that many
Mm-hmm.
studies show that Gen Z had a very, very big disadvantage as early career professionals because they lost a lot of that interaction, and a lot of those skills have been lost.
Mm-hmm.
Also, again, going back to John Haidt, he says from 2010 to 2015, you had what was all of a sudden like a rewiring where kids went from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood, which didn't do wonders for personal or soft skills or interpersonal intelligence. So if you are interacting less and less with real people on an everyday basis, and here's another thing he says, kids have to have super unsupervised child play where they learn how to deal with conflict, they learn how to negotiate, they learn how to deal with a bully, they have to learn stuff and become a little tougher so that they can be resilient and come back and deal with these kinds of things. That's as far as Gen Z goes. Now, as far I'm sorry, go ahead.
Which is all three of my children were born between 2010 and 2015. They did do a lot of playing and they didn't get phones.
Yes. So that's really important. And I think that now there's no denying, we didn't know what we didn't know back in the day of like social media. And that's basically when social media came into the scene. But now we know the adverse effects it has had on children. So now that we know better, that now it's time to make sure that our young people aren't being sucked into a world of terrible mental health issues. And look, as an adult, I can tell you also this whole comparative, when you're stuck in social media, you can go into a rabbit hole and you do lose yourself. You forget to talk to the people across the table and your interpersonal intelligence can get atrophied. So if that can happen to an adult, and I'll give you an example, when I'm scrolling through LinkedIn and all of a sudden I start feeling inadequate because I'm like, oh my gosh, this person has their act together and I'm like such a big fat loser. And then I'm like, wait a minute. Can you imagine what that does to Instagram can do to a 13-year-old? So these are some of the things that I think we're learning. And in retrospect, it's why it's so important for there to be the help and support, the training, the practice of people learning how to speak to each other, the interpersonal intelligence piece. And here's another thing. They say we're going from a knowledge economy to a human interaction economy, because guess what? AI is taking over the knowledge. A lot of the jobs are being given to AI. So what's left? And from everything that I've read, it's like we're still going to have to work alongside AI and with each other. So the value is going to be placed on those interpersonal relationships. And the better you are at that, probably the more your value is going to increase.
Interesting. Goodness, I'm in the right business then. So tell me the kind of work that you do. How do you develop people's interpersonal intelligence?
I basically help organizations work with their teams to untangle all of those communication issues so that they can get stuff done, in a nutshell. So whether those differences, for example, have to do with difficulties between remote teams, which most teams nowadays are remote. Okay. You've got intercultural issues. So I just did a program with a group that had team members in China, in India, in Egypt, in Mexico, and Australia. So you've got all of those team members, and sometimes they're like, why won't this person give me the bad news? Or why won't this person answer me? Or what? So you've got all of these things where it's like you need to be aware of the cultural nuances, number one. So that's one thing that you can learn. I work with also executives when they need to polish their soft skills a little bit. But it ultimately comes down to, most of my clients are like, you know what, I'm stuck in this situation, whether it's dealing with stakeholders, dealing with clients, or cross-functional teams that are not getting things done. That's where I jump in and help them out. And it's usually, there are 5 elements that I find that usually help out. The first one is basically like conveying your intention, starting out with that why.
Mm-hmm.
Another one is basically listening, knowing how to use open-ended questions, right? The other one is empathy, like we just talked about, assuming the best and not the worst in people. The other one is adapting. How can you adapt? Whether the adaptation has to do with cross-cultural issues or style issues, whether you're a high D in the disc or a high C or whatever. So that has a whole realm to itself. And the last one is like reframing things positively. So instead of focusing on what you can't do, what can you do to solve it? So I call that my little CLEAR model, CLEAR. So that usually works. And I work with some kind of element more or less simultaneously or sequentially, depending on what needs to be done within the teams.
Yeah, that sounds like it's like the recipe.
Yes.
It's like the ingredients of the recipe.
Yes.
Um, how do you teach people to listen? I heard you say open-ended questions, but what does that look like when you're doing the sessions? Do you have them practice listening to each other?
So everything from something that works pretty well is giving people like situations. So I'll work with my clients and I'll ask them like, okay, where are you most stuck? Give me an example. And then we might develop like a simple case based on what they tell me. And then we might do a role play. And many times we'll stop and say, okay. And it's fun because you can have other people chime in as to what they saw. So I'm like, okay, imagine you have a cartoon where you have what people thought that you normally don't get. So what did you think when you heard this or that? And so that's where I work with them regarding, okay, you want to negotiate something, but you're using too much pushing energy. How can you explore to find out? Because you can't really make a good proposal if you're just counter proposing because you don't know what the underlying need is. So I have them, I'm like, ask open-ended questions. Don't make it a closed-ended question. Don't make it so that they can just answer yes or no. Don't make it so that they feel like they have to push back. And so I'll have them practice open-ended questions. And of course, paraphrasing, okay, what I'm hearing you say is this. Am I right? Yeah, okay. So what would be the next thing we would do for this to work for you? Or how would you do this better? What suggestions do you have? So those are the kinds of questions that they can ask that'll make the listening so much more effective than just like sitting there and nodding their head and going, huh.
So a lot of the work that you do is with a group? Like it's like group?
I do both individual coaching for executives, which are a little bit longer programs throughout a certain time, executive coaching, and I work with group coaching programs. And I also do speaking engagements, shorter programs.
How have you seen the workplace change, the dynamics change in the last 4 years post-pandemic?
Well, I can tell you as somebody who does this for a living that we went much more into the virtual world. And in the beginning, I was like, oh, this is great. I don't have to travel as much. But it's funny, you get what you wish for. And then you're like, ooh, gee. Yes, I can tell you that one thing I definitely noticed is that people's attention span has gotten really shorter. I find that when you work virtually, you are sacrificing a little bit of quality because it's so easy for people to get distracted and try to multitask and not do anything 100%. So for me, that's been a struggle to get people actually engaged. So the whole rules of the game changed a lot. And I assume that must be the case as well with other things. I read this article and it floored me, Helena. I read this. It was a study on the state of business communication that the Harris poll put out with Grammarly last year. And it said that the United States wastes about $1.2 trillion on faulty communication every year. That's about $12,500 per employee. And it said that a lot of it had to do with the fact that people spend half of their work week on written asynchronous communication versus real-time communication. And if you think about it, it makes sense. You and I have probably lived through this where you send somebody an email and they take a while to answer and they answer the email, but they don't answer the question and you got to write back. And then you're just going back and forth and things don't get done. And you think, okay, this could have been solved in a 5-minute conversation. How much time did I just invest in explaining everything and referencing and blah, blah, blah? And I could have just done it in 5 minutes. And we don't realize how much time, effort, and resources we're wasting because, again, generationally and technologically, we've gotten into these habits of avoiding the real-time interactive communication.
Yeah. They're just picking up the phone and calling.
Who calls anybody anymore? Spontaneous.
I do.
Do you?
I do because I have that. I am very good at that moment of, okay, this needs to not be written. Like I have this thing where I realize, okay, this now needs to be a conversation. At that moment I'm going, and I feel like I'm about to go back to try to explain what I was saying. I'm like, okay, we should just get on.
The question is, how many people actually answer their phones anymore? That's another question. Not very many. And that started actually with millennials, that they started having that averse reaction to phone calling. But
I feel like I've actually started answering my calls recently. I wonder if it's because
who started?
That people have started answering the phone.
Okay.
And I wonder if it is because not very many people call anymore. So you actually see someone's name that you're like, oh, hey, what's happening?
What?
Is it an emergency?
But it's usually people assume that it's something urgent. It's what's the emergency, right?
What's happening? It's all right.
Are you okay?
Yeah,
it's true. It's true. And you almost feel like you're imposing it if you make a spontaneous phone call. But which 10, 15 years ago wasn't the case. But I don't know. It's probably because we're doing so many more things at the same time. We are multitasking all the time. But in our quest to multitask, the truth is we're not doing any one thing 100% and correctly. And yes, I can see that sometimes it's practical, but other times, like you said, when you know it's time to stop going back and forth, I actually have that as one of the exercises with my teams, that I give them a few different cases. I'm like, okay, what's the medium you would use? What's the channel you would use for a situation like that? And it gets people thinking, oh my gosh, yeah, that's true. Maybe I have been spending too much time going back and forth. And what is that costing you when it comes down to it? How many hours?
And when you've got a little bit of conflict on a team, it becomes so much harder trying to craft the email and thinking and making sure they're not going to misinterpret this or misinterpret that, and just trying to it becomes like a landmine.
Well, that was part of the study. Also mentioned the fact that people fret about how to put into written form something when it's delicate. It takes them forever to do that. Now we've got ChatGPT, and you can tell Chatty, tell me how to be nice about this. And it can craft it. But you still have to put in all of the prompts and the context. Whereas maybe a phone call, you could do your little disclaimer. Hey, listen, I don't mean to be a pain. I just want to see if we're on the same page and get this rolling. Okay, great. And you can just do it that way.
Talk about that a lot when I'm dealing with people that are in conflict, is after we've had that reparative facilitated conversation, that for at least the next few months, the two of you need to communicate in person, over the phone, but really avoid any kind of emailing, texting until you've got more of a foundation underneath you. It's just too easy to fill in the gaps when there's none of the tone and the other pieces of the communication rather than the words.
Yeah, and it's too easy to assume. Because you create a narrative, and if you don't clarify it with the other person, your narrative keeps getting bigger and bigger, like a big monster, assuming, oh, this person is trying to disrespect me and they're not taking me into account. So you become a little more defensive, and the other person, and it's like, wait a minute, that might not even be it. You might be.
And the moment you feel or think that, you have to pick up the phone. Like that there, if you're starting to put a narrative or putting a tone on the other person, I think you've got to pick up the phone. I had that over the weekend with somebody that I was texting about, and I was like, oh, I think she's misunderstood me. I think I'll just save that for a conversation.
Yes. And luckily you're like, okay, she is misinterpreting something. But how many times do we not even have a clue? And then we're like floored when somebody has a behavior that we can't really figure out or interpret. And then you get offended. And that's the other thing, going back to the whole thing. how easily do you get offended? Is
Right.
that kind of like, oh, now I'm mad and I don't want to talk to you anymore? Guess what? You can't just avoid your stakeholders and colleagues forever. You got to deal with it, right?
I think you can escalate it so much quicker virtually. Like
Yes.
when it's online, like you can get offended enough, but if you're in person, you just don't get the same level of reaction because the person's a human. It's amazing. I think it's that how people will say something online to each other they'd never say to the person's
No,
face.
no,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think, and a lot of managers, a lot of my clients who are managers are like, oh my gosh, I'm getting all this stuff escalated to me and I shouldn't have to be dealing with this. And
Yes.
it's, yep, that's where it's important. And maybe part of it, Helena, is that sometimes people don't feel equipped to deal with the conflict. They're like, I'm just afraid. I don't trust myself. I might get too emotional or I might go overboard or I don't want to offend this other person more. And so that's why it's so important for people to have the skills, the interpersonal intelligence skills, so that they feel, okay, it's going to be okay. I can be assertive and still respectful and repair whatever is going on at that first level of conflict. So it doesn't get to the third level where it's probably survival of the fittest. And you don't want to get to that point.
And that's why I always say it's a skill that you have to practice. You really have to build up the ability and the confidence to be able to address it at that first level.
Exactly.
And then it's easy. What else? Tell me what's one of the most rewarding situations you've worked on recently.
I can just tell you that on Friday, I started out working with a quality control director at a pharmaceutical company. And I was just at the end of our session, and you probably can relate to this. When somebody says to you, I had these really low expectations, but what you have helped me see has been so useful that I'm excited about this. I feel empowered. To me, that's music to my ears when somebody's like, oh my gosh, okay, this is really useful and I'm not nervous about this anymore and I can go out, and that to me is so inspiring. And that's why I love what I do. I love people. I love communication. I'm a natural extrovert, so I guess that makes sense. I'm a high DI in my disc. So getting things done and connecting with people they're my thing. I love to talk to people, to help them get where they need to go to get things done. So to me, that's the best part of this job.
Yeah. I love it when people come in and they've got low expectations. They really don't think that this is going to do anything because they believe the situation is beyond repair. And then they do get to the other side of it, and just what a relief it is. I think people underestimate the impact of when you're in an escalated situation, when you've got that conflict going on in the workplace, and what a relief it is to not have it hanging over you.
Absolutely. And the only way to do that is feeling confident that whatever you're hit with, you can navigate it and it's not the end of the world. There's something to be said. I always joke with my clients. I'm like, you know how your mom always said, count to 10. There's a reason for that. You need to take that deep breath and let your thinking brain be the one making the decisions instead of your amygdala or your primitive brains.
I spoke to a woman, her name's Hesha Abrams, a while ago, and she's someone who's mediated a lot of really high stakes cases and dealt with a lot of very high conflict personalities. And she's one of the few people that I've ever met that you could just tell she had 100% confidence in herself in any situation. She knew she could communicate her way through anything. It was really interesting, and I aspire to be that person.
So it was the confidence that she exuded that was inspiring. It's going to be okay. I can resolve this. Or what was it specifically that impressed you?
It was the comfort that she had in herself, and just the complete lack of anxiety going into any situation. She you could just tell that nothing would faze her. She knew she could get through anything. Whereas I think most of us have a button here and there that we're afraid might get pushed. and we might not be able to function at our best in a situation. But yeah, she'd just been in so many of these environments and just had complete confidence that whatever was going to come out of her mouth was okay.
And I would assume, I don't know what her technique is, but I would assume that there's probably part of her that has to reframe how she sees the other party with a certain level of what, you're a good person. I have to assume that you have the intention of making things work rather than going in a very adversarial energy. Yeah, and I think that probably would lower your cortisol, but you probably have to do the work first here before you can, I would think. And you know what? I remember somebody once saying to me, patience is love. And I was like, that's a little strange. But the more you think about it, when you are frustrated or the adrenaline's starting to run, if you see the other person with a certain level of patience, and we could start with our families, right?
Yeah.
But I think that there's a lot to be said about taking that step back, being patient, and giving people the benefit of the doubt in order to be an effective communicator.
With that, thank you so much for your time, Maria. I really appreciated your insights and enjoyed our conversation.
I enjoyed it as well. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks.